Oh my goodness. Excuse me. Tansei, hello everyone. I'm going to introduce myself in my language, which is Nihiao, and then I will again repeat myself in English just before we get started. Because what I'm taught is that when we share spaces like this and we introduce ourselves and say our names, we're letting the ancestors know who's visiting with them today. And so I just love that. So danse tata wow kakiano wagmaganak. Apita kisukupi e sun nitsigasun egwa Chantelle. High level Otunia, Egwa 4 per million, Meander River, Stony Point, Egwa North Bay, Egwa Lac-Saint-Anne. Nia Ikweu, Egwa Wia. Nihiao Egwa Michif. Okay, I said a lot to you, so let me tell you what I said. I said, hello, welcome, all my relations. My name is Southern Thunderbird. My name gifted to me by my grandmother is Chantelle. I'm originally born in Treaty 8, so way up north in Northern Alberta in High Level. But my family, through my grandmothers, come to those other beautiful places that I mentioned. I am two-spirited. I use they, them pronouns, and I am Métis and Cree. So I just let you know a little bit about who I am. Okay, the other thing I'd like to say in starting is Naskumtin Nawao to Sienna, and not only to Sienna, but to CAAN, and to each and every one of you. I said I'm grateful. Thank you so much for inviting me here today to visit and share a little bit of my story and my understanding of what reclaiming our ways of knowing being is when we are disconnected from it, as well as working within a system that doesn't support it. And so how do we um, balance that, I guess? It's always about the balance, right? And so yeah, I just wanted to say how grateful I am to talk to you about that. And the best way that I know how to sit and share space is through storytelling. And so that's what my teachers teach me anyway. And so I'm hoping that through sharing some of my story and some of my work, that maybe by the end of this, it can inspire that we can do things a little bit different. That's the magic of being human. We are all given so many gifts and they're so beautiful. So when we honor those gifts and bring it to the work, that right there is just harm reduction. So, um, yeah, where do I want to start? So I guess I will tell you some of the most impactful parts. So my background, my Western background, and please understand that my degrees and diplomas are covered up by my tattoo artist artwork that I don't, that's what they call me. That's not necessarily what I call myself. And so they're mostly just tools. But my Western background, they say that I am a life coach and a counselor, and I specialize in addictions. After my first experience into serving community, I was serving youth. I was serving youth, 14 to 24-year-olds, and they were completely street level, PGO, TGO, caught up in the system, facing every barrier imaginable, of course, and then the justice system and whatever that looks like. And so, and I was so green. And of course, I suppose it's important to even go back a little bit further and to understand that I was not raised with my way of knowing and being. I was not raised with my culture. I was not raised with my traditions. That doesn't mean my family didn't give me clues. I am the first person in my family to not attend a residential school or a day school. So it was very much a safety thing in my family because I am so white presenting to very much honor that part of my side. So please, I was very, very green when I started to serve community. And so it was community and especially my youth who took on the burden, I suppose to say, of creating and teaching me to be a better worker, a better helper. And so so I was serving the youth, and I remember we served, I think the last stats we had, we had 750 unique individuals that would access our drop-in services. We were basically a crisis drop-in resource center. Crisis all the time. Let's emphasize crisis. And so but they could access, some of those youth would only access once a month for a bus pass, and others needed to access multiple times a day. So it was really, you never knew. Sometimes we had 2 people in the drop-in, sometimes we had 35, right? It was never consistent, whatever it was. And so we had this registration sheet in the front of our drop-in that our youth, or we would require them to fill out. And so this is one of the first teachings. Now, I did introduce myself as Ikweyu, as Two-Spirit, but please understand, I never had that language. I never had that understanding. I always knew I was different. But again, I was never given any teachings on what that was. And so it was actually the youth who gave me my first gender teachings. Isn't that incredible? And so that even opened the possibilities for something more. And so we had this registration sheet that we would require street level, youth to fill out. And so it was their name, their age, their gender, and their ethnicity. And then we would check off what programs they accessed. And so I remember this, one of the first times, and the executive director was looking at the sheet for the stats and came to me and said, "Chantelle, what's going on here?" And I looked at it and I'm like, "I don't know what's going on here." And they said, "Well, why did this youth put that under gender?" I said, "I don't know. Why don't you ask them?" And so she said, "Well, actually, no, that's your job to monitor this. This is for our stats. And so I need you to go and ask them and to clarify." And so I got the lovely role of going over and asking one of our youth to explain what they put down under gender. And so I went over to the couch and I sat down and I had my clipboard in my hand and I looked at them and I said, "Hi, lovely. I've been asked to ask you something and I'm just curious as to your response." And they're like, "Okay." And so I said, "Under your gender, you wrote fish. You care to explain that? Can you give me just let me know what that looks like to you?" And they looked at me and they said, "Chantelle, what is gender anyway? If today I wanted to tell you I wanted to be a fish, does that affect how you're going to give me services?" And I said, "Oh, huh. No, I think it's amazing that you put down whatever, because, but just to open up the possibilities that there could be something more." And so I took the clipboard back to the ED and I said, "It's good. We're good." right? And so it was those stories and those teachings and in sitting with my youth, and it just grew from there. Um, During COVID, when COVID hit, like I said, it was a drop in, right? And so we were doing all we could when everything shut down, and like our youth would hustle for food and stuff. And so at the drop in, just sitting with them and building relationship with them, and I used to keep full-size chocolate bars on my desk in a candy jar for them. And so that was my check-in, because who doesn't want a full-size candy bar? And so they come in and they're like, "Hey, Chantelle, can we grab a candy bar?" And I'm like, "Of course you can, but how are you? What's going on? Got anything new?" They came in for the candy bar, but we ended up gifting me a conversation and a check-in. And I got to see their face and do that observation, right? Okay, we've got some skin on our bones, we have a phone, we have clothes, we've got a backpack. Excellent. Um, and so yeah, it was through that work and just building relationship and stuff. And then like I said, during COVID, um, when everything shut down, I started to hear, well, this dude would let us stay on his couch if we engaged in sex work. So that was one of the resources that was starting to happen, is because there was nowhere for these kids to go and make $1. Like they couldn't even panhandle, right? And so they were starting to engage in sex work for a place to stay. Well, I knew the chocolate bar thing worked. So what I started doing was hustling the food bank. And I started to put together emergency food hampers, because where else are they going to get food? And so I made sure that there was like teenager snacks. Who doesn't love noodles and craft dinner and, chips? And I made pop and made sure that these were like really bougie food hampers. And it worked. They started coming in and accessing the food hampers. "Chantelle, I got a place to stay, but I need one of those food hampers." Get out of here. And it started happening. I was preparing up to 30, 40 food hampers a month. And we were keeping kids safe and housed, right? And it was just that outside of the box thinking. And it started with that first pebble, which was chocolate bars, and the work and just building relationship with the community and sitting with them. However, again, that system that, doesn't really understand when we try and do things outside of the box. Because of the lack of resources towards my end of the time, it was still during COVID times. My end of my employment at OSIS was because I had ended up losing my mom in January of 2020. And then after that, I had proceeded to lose 12 youth that I supported. So I lost 13 in a very short amount of time. And I lost myself as well, almost. And the final straw, though, was when I took a mental health leave from the center. And upon my return to work, one of the first things I was told that I had to stop doing was accessing the food bank and spend more time in the drop-in without ever having a conversation with me about why. Why were you spending so much time at the food bank, Chantelle? And so, and of course, the executive directors was going on holidays, and so there couldn't have been a conversation, and I felt stuck, so I left. And during that time, I took some time, did counseling, therapy, lots of time on the land, lots of time walking, just breathing. And then I was still very lost, very, very lost and angry, so incredibly angry. And then my journey took me to actually an HIV serving agency here in the city. And it was interesting because at the time when I was at the youth agency, my title was the Indigenous Resource Coordinator, and I still wasn't connected to culture. And literally all I was basically doing was handing out smudge kits. You know what I mean? Because we were so focused on that crisis work and that resource work. And not that it was just only smudge kits, please take that with a grain of salt, but I was more to say that towards my limited connection and education at the time. The power of our smudge is very, very. So I went to, but no connections to elders, knowledge keepers, helpers in community. So, and even my own family stories. So then I was directed to, like I said, an HIV serving agency here in the city, and I was on the prevention and education team. So, and they had already started to do some beautiful connecting work. It was through that agency that was the doorway into my own reconnection into culture, if you can even imagine that gift. Because when I went there, their executive director at the time, still had already been building relationships in a good way and had an elder that came in and sat with our community in the drop-in center. She would visit and bring beading and moccasins and just sit there and just be accessible, you know, doing amazing things like that so that community could come in and just visit and just ask, those organic and beautiful questions that come up, right? And it was never just all of this, it was not always about what was happening to them or going on. It was just their thoughts. So it was to have access to that. And then they were also, as an agency, doing incorporating circle work as their way of knowing and being, with staff meetings, with conflict resolution. So I went from a place that was very structured and very, to a different place where, I mean, we know what we're doing when we're in a nonprofit agency and what we're up against and the things, right? So, but to have access to that was incredible. And I wasn't there a month, and the executive director had understood how much I was struggling and called a circle with an elder and all of the staff. And it was simply for me. And that was my first introduction and reconnecting into the power of our ways. It was a full circle, just going by, being guided by my grief and my spirit. I had actually created a staff. I had never done this before. I created a staff and I had tied 13 ribbons onto it. And I said each of those youth and my mom name, because the 13th youth was actually also related to me. She was my cousin. And because, of course, with the systems, I could never tell her that because I was her worker. But, part of MMIWG. So started with my mom and she, ended with that. So it was really yeah, and so I didn't know what else to do. And so created a staff. And that was my gate, my doorway, my protocol. That was my commitment. And actually the elder I'd never met before um, saw something, I guess, in me and took me under their wing. And that was the first time I'd ever been introduced even to an elder. And I got to sit with them for 2 years and learn how to facilitate circle, how to support circle. So that was the gift, that's that's so much of the gift of, walking through that grief and trusting, and then but also being open, right? And knowing that you can't do it alone. Because I never, if I had to, try and stayed in one spot and without that connection to the HIV serving, agency, I don't know where I would have been, because it was through that work, because we ran like my work alone, we held it in circle. I would go into different agencies in town, and my entire presentation started with an elder and prayer. And then we would talk about, you know, everything to do with HIV and STBBIs through circle and through spirit. And like, that's when I first sat with and learned it, and learning in those spaces, honestly, was that shame cannot exist where there is joy. It can't, because, you know, every single time, like, we would sit and just visit. And I mean, they were facing some of the most brutal barriers. And that's what they taught me, right? Is that, well, I, rem- I remember this one time, one of my community members, 56-year-old Indigenous person that unhoused, all kinds of things, um, street level, but we were working on it, right? We were working on it. And one day we had an appointment, and that's what we would do. We would meet weekly, and they'd come to me for an appointment. And so I picked them up in the Jeep and off we went. We went to their appointment. They did their thing. And then they came back, and I was at the office, dropped them off, and I was like, all right, my friend, well, that's this for this week. What time are we meeting next week to go, and what do you need to do so that we can be prepared? He looked at me and he said, Chantelle, why does it always have to be appointments? Why does it always have to be something that's scheduled? Why can't we ever just hang out? And of course, I'm like, we can do that? Like, it never even crossed my mind. And of course, I go to thinking, like, well, I'm at work. Like, how am I supposed to make that, like, you know? And, but in my guts, I just went for it. And I said, you know what? Yeah, let's do next week. No appointments. We'll figure out what we got to do, what we have to take care of, but we'll just meet and hang out. So that day, of course, still trying to work within the things I needed to work within. Um, I came in early, an hour early, and then I took it around my lunchtime. So I had carved out 2 hours in there. And so so it came to the day, and we're sitting there. And now remember, this person is totally houseless, street level, caught up in the system, right? Like, and so he's coming towards us, on time, by the way, on time to hang out. And he's carrying a pelt, like a fur pelt, like this of an animal. He's carrying it and he's unhoused. So I'm not sure where an unhoused person is getting a fur pelt from, but that's what he was doing. So he was coming over to me and we were getting ready to go, but of course I got curious and I looked at and he opens up the door and he's like, I'm almost ready. And I said, okay. And he said, but I got something for you first. And I said, oh, he said, yeah, I got something for you first. And I said, what's that? And he said, here, hang on. And so he pulled out his back pocket and he pulled out this giant hunting knife. And so I'm sitting up front, not knowing what's happening. And then he took that knife and he whacked off a piece of the paw and he hands it to me and he said, here, Chantelle, this is a bobcat paw. With your driving, you need more than a rabbit's foot. And so, and then he got in and we went out and we hung out. And it had nothing to do with appointments or anything that, he was going through. We were just two human beings talking. And you want to know where he took me? He took me down to the river valley here in Victoria Park. And we went for a walk in the river valley and he showed me where the wild onions were growing. And we picked the wild onions and we brought them back to the drop-in and we made soup for lunch for everybody. Now, don't get me wrong. Everybody knew that he picked those onions and that we did this and that we made this soup so much better for them. But nonetheless, that was something that he could give back. He took care of the entire drop-in and me, and so many stories and possibilities. And like when I was working at that agency, we would do community days. And so we would load up our wagons. Well, I always had a wagon. And in my wagons, I'd put all of my harm reduction, all of my socks and my granola bars, all of my snacks, all of my things. And I always have a Cookum scarf on. That's just something I always do. And I always pack a couple of extra Cookum scarves with me because I usually end up giving one or two away when I'm downtown especially. And so I'd had one of my Cookum scarves, or I had that. And then I had learned through the delivery of that program that we were doing, and then also through that one documentary, Strong Medicine, 100%. Like we utilize that tool in our workshops, and it was phenomenal. But I learned through those resources as well that I don't just pack my wagon. I packed my bundle. So I would pack my sage, I would pack my rat root, I would pack sweetgrass, I would pack, some of those traditional medicines and those helpers, and then my Cookum scarves, and just pack them and have them on me in my own bundle. So I call my backpack my bundle because in that has everything I need. If I ever go downtown and I need to serve community in some way, I have my bundle. It has my naloxone, it has my first aid kit, but it has my little emergency medicine kit. Like it has everything, both water, you know what I mean. So, but I call that my bundle. And so I'm always building on my bundle. And so I had my bundle with me, and so we hit the streets, and we're going to visit community. And part of what it was for me too with harm reduction and reconnecting and making it make sense was also very much focusing on my language. They are not my clients. They are my community. I am not their worker. They are the people I serve. They are the people I support. Changing my own language is where it first. I don't say that, I'm going to go work in community. I'm going to visit. I'm going to sit with them. They're inviting me in. And when you start to change your language about that and how your perspective in that simple way, that's that relationship building piece. It's less othering and more connection, right? And that's really important when we're doing this work, right? Because it's important that we fight the system and not each other. And that's harm reduction right there, right? Fighting that system and not each other. And I had to learn that hard, right? So, and I find with even changing that language, it helped me to be less mean and ignorant to people. And when you're less mean and less ignorant, then what replaces that is kindness and compassion and understanding. So, yeah, and that comes back to a teaching I'll share afterwards, but I'll finish telling you this one story because it's a good one. And so anyways, I had packed my bundle and we headed down to visit with community. And I remember we were going right in front of the SCS site. So the safe consumption site is where we were visiting. And as I was walking up to the parking lot, oh, the smell hit me first. And it was a sweet, rotten smell. And so for me, after working with my youth and having to tend to their feet and many wounds, I learned what the smell of infection smells like. And so I just kept serving people and taking care of people and just slowly making my way forward. And finally, I got to the source. And so I came upon a group of 3 people, and they were sitting there. They were just sitting huddled. They were just on a couple of things like on the ground. And they were visiting. And I had my wagons and I'm like, hey everyone. I said, how you doing? How's it going? What's new? You guys need anything? Blah, blah, blah. And then I looked at the one gentleman and I said, my friend, I said, how are you? And he's like, yeah, I'm all right. And I said, well, you can absolutely tell me to back off and I will respect that. I said, but I can't help but notice that maybe you're in a bit of distress with your arm. His arm, it was blood poisoning. Like it was absolutely foul what was happening. And then the bandages, and it was foul. And he looked at me and he gave me this great big smile, but he had no teeth. It was the most beautiful smile I have ever seen. He's like, don't worry about that. And I'm like, well, my friend, I'm going to be honest with you. I am worried. I am concerned about that. Have you gone to the hospital? Or would you be interested? I can support you with that. Chantelle, I'm not going to the hospital. They don't treat me very well there. And I said, okay, I can understand that. And he did happen to be an indigenous brother. And remembering my bundle on me, I said, hey, have something to ask you. And he's like, what's that? And I said, I understand and I hold space that you don't want to go to the hospital. That's completely fair. I said, but I happen to have some rat root in my bundle. Do you know what that is? Now, rat root is an incredible anti-inflammatory. It is one of our go-to medicines for colds, flus, viruses. Like, it's pretty bitter, but it does the job incredible. It supports the immune system just immensely well. And uh, it's called Wikas. Yeah. And so he looks at me again with that grin. Ma, my cookum used to make me take that stuff, he said to me. We're outside of a safe consumption site. This man has blood poisoning and he's going to lose his arm. And he's sitting there telling me about his cookum, making him take this stuff. And so I looked at him and I said, my friend, I have some. If you know how to use it, and clearly you do, I'd like to gift it to you. If you would take it. He said, oh, Chantelle, yeah, I would take your rat root, but I can't. What? Why can't you take my rat root, my friend? Well, Chantelle, we don't have any tobacco. Again, sitting outside of a safe consumption site, going to lose his arm from blood poisoning, and this human being is concerned about offering me tobacco before he takes my rat. So I reached down, because I wasn't a smoker at the time, I reached down and I picked up a cigarette butt and I ripped off the filter and I ripped off the burnt end and I put the few grains of tobacco in my hand and I looked at him and I said, oh, my Fred, Creator is so good. We have tobacco right here. Can you take my rat root now? Oh, okay, I'll take it now. He said, snatch. There we go. Our friend isn't no longer. He ended his earth walk a while ago, but I share his story and that teaching in honor of the gift he gave me. That beautiful gift, and that's what I mean, right? It's hard, but we can do things in a good way, in a different way. And that's what my community taught me, right? I still remember when I was so green and I handed out my very first harm reduction, the works, as my youth would call it. I must have spent half an hour afterwards feeling sorry for myself and, oh my gosh, I feel so bad, when really I was feeling bad for myself and not understanding that maybe I just helped to keep someone safe for when they're ready to come back and talk to me, and just keep, because nobody really teaches you that, right? And so, nobody shares that understanding with you, so that you don't go through that. And that's really important, because what I've come to learn and understand about this work, and it doesn't matter what community we serve people. And is that it comes down to the very first teaching I was ever gifted. And I'm going to share that teaching with y'all, because it's the one that makes the most sense to me, and it's one that I work on every single day. And whether that's in my own personal life or in my own work life, because see, for me, there's no difference. It's simply about balance, because I'm not a different person when I serve community or I sit with community than I am when I sit with my family. I show up with the same values, the same integrity. And see, and I wasn't taught that also in work and in school. I was taught that I had to keep that very separate. And I would exhaust myself keeping that very separate. Like, and I'm not a separate person, right? We're a whole person. And so it was just for me simply about finding the balance, because I understand that. But that teaching, my cook, or well, I call her Auntie, Nagawi sis Trudy. She's a community grandmother and an elder here in the city, and she's my mentor. And she asked me, she said, my girl, she's the only one allowed to call me that, by the way. She said, do you know what the longest journey a human being can ever take is? And me, of course, I'm thinking distant, right? I'm thinking, oh, it's got to be like Australia, or like, just being all. I totally went there. I was always the first kid to raise my hand, whether I knew the answer or not. And so, so I went there, and she just, so my aunt has this really cool eyebrow. And when you say something ridiculous, I'm sure, Sienna, you've seen the eyebrow. When she raises that eyebrow, what goes off in my head is Shania Twain's You Don't Impress Me Much. And that kind of happened. And she looks at me and she said, no, that's not right. And then she looks at me and she says, my girl, the longest journey a human being can take is from their head to their heart. She said, but guess what? Here's the magic of being a person, a spirit person. She said, when we engage in the work, when we walk softly on Mother Earth, when we take care of each other and do all of those good things, it starts to balance out. And guess where it balances out? Behind our mouth. And what comes out is our medicine. And so that's really the teaching. If we can stay in our heart spaces when we do this work, we're going to be practicing harm reduction. We're going to be reconnecting, because that's our spirit. That's where love is. And so that's what, kind of what I do now with the work. Oh yeah, and if there is any questions or anything you want me to ever clarify, I'm super, super easygoing, y'all. Like, just jump in, because I know it's funny. My aunt also says working with me sometimes is like herding kittens, because I do go down on different rabbit holes and different stories. So.
Well, thank you so much, Chantelle, for sharing that. I really felt that was really good. I'd like to open the floor to our community, and if you have any questions or you'd like to share anything, you can raise your hand. You can enter it in the chat. You can enter it in the Q&A, and I will be happy to share that. Chantelle, you really kind of opened it up there with the importance of being present in community. And I'd like to ask what helped you kind of make that connection. Like, you had spoken about the changing of language of instead of saying like, this is my client, this is community, or this is kin. So like, what made you make that jump? Was it someone saying like, hey, this is what you should be doing? Or was it community? Like, how did that happen?
Actually, it's really interesting that you say that, because I do have a story that connected me to my language. Okay, now